Spread the fire, fam. Welcome back to SMWX, and today I'm really excited to bring you a two-part interview with Mayor Lebohang Pheko, one of South Africa's most exciting and incisive public intellectuals, from economics to history to current affairs. She's really one of the best minds that we have analyzing social problems. So whether you're watching part one or part two, make sure you check the other parts and like, share, subscribe. Thank you for taking us to beyond 20,000 subscribers. Let's get into it. Ayeye. That's so. Just what you say also about the many millions actually who have suffered under silent neglect and structural neglect, in addition to the violence, is something we don't think about. And of course, also takes us back to a painful history of, millions again suffering, maybe in silence, being confined to these open air spaces for Black people. And that for me is just the most difficult thing to reckon with when I meditate on apartheid as an idea. Is just the sheer scale of the social control. I understand that many tens of thousands were directly murdered, but just the millions, and still today we have the system and situation where millions are still confined and are still effectively unable to emerge. And the solution, I'm starting to wonder, is quite, and this is the second bankruptcy actually, is the solution is this ideology of non-racialism, which I'm very confused about. I just think maybe it may have had a noble moment, back in the 1980s or something. Even that is probably in dispute. But it seems to me this idea of non-racialism has now been co-opted by, quite frankly, the DA, the Institute of Race Relations, people who want to use the N-word and then pretend that they are, entitled to do so because of non-racialism. And a conception of racial justice has been lost, it seems to me, in this whole notion of non-racialism.
I think there are a couple of issues with non-racialism, Sizwe, and I think it depends firstly on our construction of race and the meaning that we give race, the meaning that we attribute to race. And that, there's kind of a dialogic danger in non-racialism, in that it then risks race blindness. I don't see raceness, which is really a form of toxic racism in itself. So the notion of, I don't see race is actually usually constructed by whiteness in its attempt to disappear or to erase Blackness from a center of consideration, in my humble view. And it also suggests, of course, that race categories are insignificant, even though we know that they're significant in our life outcomes. They're significant in our economic aspirations and in our economic outcomes and participation. They're significant in our political outlook. They're significant in where we live, where we go to school, as we've mentioned, if we are able to even access education and so forth, or higher education. They're significant in even the ways in which we have measured and determined what a good education is and a good school is. So a good school, a good education, let's be truthful, viewers, is a school that is formally white or predominantly white, for a beginning. And we talk about non-racial, or we behave as though race has race is not a factor. We really run the risk of a really violent and extremely a violent way of silencing Black pain, a violent way of erasing a history, a millennia history of imperialism, of white-led domination, of white-led colonialism, of white-instigated settler colonialism as well. And it suggests, in fact, that race is a thing that's an abstraction, that we choose to see color. Of course we don't. We are Black, we are white, we are Indian, we are Chinese, it's nonsense to say that it's just it's a construct. No, it's not. When a person sees me, they don't see a construct, they see a Black woman with pink hair. That is what they see. They don't see a construct, right? And I think that to pretend it otherwise, it's actually the easy way out, particularly in terms of race trouble. And added to this sort of non-racialism and so forth is the notion of diversity. It's hidden under these other things: transformation, diversity, and all of these other ways of diluting and depoliticizing race politics and its implications. Because once we depoliticize them, we also begin to dilute the demands that they will make on those who have been the perpetrators of racism and who have been the benefactors or the beneficiaries of race-based benefits. So that means that it averts a conversation of land, it averts a conversation on redistribution, it averts a conversation on reparations. In the US and in the Caribbean, colleagues of mine have been working very hard on the question of reparations for enslaved African people. And so, when we say that there is no race, or that we are all a non-race, or that we are all shades of gray, as some colleagues in Brazil have tried to hypothesize, that didn't go very well. It completely diminishes our being. And I think it also silences Black pain. And I think that's violent, it's dishonest, and it doesn't really take us forward.
Absolutely. And, I think one of the reasons I'm so excited to have you on the show is that you combine historical analysis and critical analysis with a very sharp eye on the economy and economics as well. And so I wonder, what you make of this recent turn to austerity, but also this argument that there is no more room for ambitious redistribution in South Africa because we have reached the fiscal cliff, and redistribution would be lovely, but unfortunately it's just no longer possible.
Mm-hmm. So, in anticipation of that question, I actually dug around a bit and I looked for stuff, the kind of unauthorized or wasted expenditure of the last couple of years, and just to show the extent to which we have fiscal space. In education, so in the previous financial year, fair enough pre-COVID, but nonetheless, in the previous financial year, the unauthorized expenditure in the Department of Education was 989 million rands. Water and sanitation was about 489 million rands. In health, that was about 241 million rands. Human settlements, that was about 17.5 million rands, and so on and so forth. So, there's money lying around, and that's money that has been either unauthorized. That doesn't even include irregular expenditure, which is something, for some reason, that is defined differently. So the irregular expenditure, for example, in Eskom was about 19 million rands, Transnet 8 million rands, transport 5 million rand, in the Department of Health 5 million. So that's unauthorized expenditure. And then wasteful expenditure is about 1,000 million in the water trading entity. In education, again, wasteful expenditure, not unauthorized. Semantics there, 196 million rands, and so on and so forth. Even National Treasury itself, get this, has wastefully expended 67 million rands. So, the idea that there's no fiscal space in the face of all of this is a bit of a fallacy. And I think when we look at the sorts of spending that has been taking place during Corona. So, for example, the relief areas. So Social Security was promised 50 billion rands, and so far about 43 billion rands has been used. job creation and protection, 100 billion was promised as part of this whole Corona COVID package. 12.6 billion has been used so far. And bear in mind, Cesar, that this is in the context of businesses that have gone under, old legacy companies, especially small businesses, small town restaurants, your mums and pops stores that have gone under. This is also in the context of really a time where we would have wanted the smaller businesses to be protected, mainly because that's where 60 to 70% of our employment is actually resides. So if they're going under, and then we do the math regarding unemployment figures, and that's also kind of a short-termism, because it suggests that we're never coming out of Corona. So if we're never coming out of Corona, does this mean then that our lot in life is for businesses to go under, for us to live in debt, to continue to overextend our fiscal deficit the way that the US does, to the tune of trillions of dollars? I mean, they're never gonna. If the whole world asked back for their money, if they had to ask back the US for their money, they would never get it back. They'd literally bankrupt the US state. Is that where we're going? Are we gonna be a spend our way through it, or act like it's not, head in the sand economics? And it's this fallacy that there's no money. It's also a very market-led neoliberal. I use the word painfully because people use it like used up chippies, but it is really just such a market orthodox way of seeing the economy. And it goes back to what we were saying before, that there's no money for university students, right? It's the same dogma. It's the same logic. It's the same logic that Black people don't deserve things, to be honest. There's not enough for social benefits. There's not enough for extra childcare grants. And that we should be happy that a few extra people are getting the extra 350 rands per month. Yes, commensurate and compared to many countries across the continent, we do manage to distribute cash transfers quite effectively, SASA notwithstanding. It could always be better. But when we think about the sort of economy that we're transitioning into, Sizwe, is it one that is actually intended to transform? Is it one where is there ever gonna be a situation where you can be on social benefits for a year, 2 years, and eventually hope that you're going to eventually get a job? Or are we going into that cycle of intergenerational poverty or intergenerational joblessness? And I mean, again, the credit guarantee scheme, for example, 200 billion put aside, 18 billion spent, and yet we say there isn't enough money floating around.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear just the sheer amount. I mean, you read articles, but when you put it all together and think about how much wastage or irregularity there's been, and then you add that to the dogmas, it's really sad to see that once again we have failed to break free of orthodoxies that even predate the 1994 transition. And another one of those structural problems or failures to reimagine our society, I think, relates to the question of gender, and how somehow we have failed to centralize and prioritize the question of gender, not as something that needs to be relegated to a specific department or pigeonholed into a certain set of issues, but is actually at the center of economic justice, of prosperity, of a new vision for our society. And you've been one of the most prominent public intellectuals and economists calling for a reformation in the way that we conceive of economies, and the centrality of gender justice in economic justice and prosperity more generally.
Well, thanks for that. I mean, yeah, I think sort of the notion of gender justice, or feminist justice, perhaps I prefer, it it comes from the premise that we live multiple lives, right? That we're layered, and that it's deeply relational, so that the economy is a reflection of social relations. It's a reflection of our history, of course, and also the operation and the structures of power. Power in the workplace, corporate power, institutional power, structural power, and the composite of all that is really what we experience in our lives as either oppression or affirmation, or enabling, and all of that either enables or disables us from moving forward. And I think that, the kind of an intersectional analysis should tell us, and attempts to tell us, that women and men come at these, we have different lived experience. So for example, even in a household, people will experience, a man and a woman, for example, they may both be the working poor, or they may both be working class, or they may both, but even there are different ways of experiencing power or privilege, and also different ways of experiencing impoverishment and poverty. So poverty of voice, for example, right? Poverty of decision making, ubaba oti, you know what I mean? Poverty of influence, poverty of time, poverty of leisure. So that these myriad different ways, differentiated ways of lived experience, even within households. And those are deeply political questions. They also link to notions of, patriarchy, social relations, the way that we've constructed culture, whatever that may or may not mean to us at any given moment, right? And to sort of minimize that, I think, to how many women do you have on a board is, or how many women do you have in parliament, is really not quite the way that we need to go, because all that does is to tinker around the edges. And I heard a really brilliant quote on a conference I was attending yesterday that I was keynoting. And it was basically that we were so busy focusing on the glass ceiling that we forget about the women who are living in the basement and the water is flooding their feet. Right? And that's basically like what comes to mind when you think around all of this whole glass ceiling. It's very performative. It's, again, very individualistic. It's about celebrating individual achievements. So that woman who's on the cover of True Love, and with all due respect, some of my good friends are on the cover of True Love and Destiny, and I appreciate and I salute them. But the point I'm making is that as structural contributions, we can't say that, because, that whole notion of symbols are not enough. Structure is what's important. And so, we get all embedded in the numbers, and as long as you have a woman, which woman, Sizwe? That's the other thing. In the same way that not every Black person, as we've seen even our state, works in other Black people's interests. Not every woman is necessarily a feminist, or not every woman has a gender consciousness. Not every woman is per se gender awakened or feminist awakened. Sometimes it's because we have all been so oppressed ourselves by patriarchy as a survival mechanism. Other times, the things that we need to learn or unlearn or relearn. But I think that the way that this then plays itself out is in the way that we, social redistribution, the distribution of power, the distribution in policy, the distribution in hard rands and cents, where we put money in the social things. Why is it so difficult, for example, to find sanitary pads in public toilets, but it's so easy to find condoms for free? I mean, anybody can buy themselves a condom at the pharmacy, but it's a choice to have sex. So, what consulting adults do is their business. It's not a choice to have a menstrual cycle every month. And yet we know that every month there are young girls who are excluded from the economy, who are excluded from schooling, the social economy, the market economy, the productive economy, because of, and as a basic dignity issue. And yet, the math doesn't add up, the social policy doesn't add up. We're not centering this. Why is this not a big campaign? Why is this not a big deal? Why is there still VAT on cotton, which is one of the primary ingredients for creating sanitary pads for it, as an example? So, I mean, there's this huge incoherence between what we aspire to be, which is a gendered, forward-looking, Beijing-aligned, Beijing principle-aligned country, and what it is that we actually do. And yeah, I mean, I'll say less about some of the women who are in power, but let's just suffice it to say, they don't necessarily help the cause.
absolutely. No. Yeah, I could really talk to you all day. I feel like this conversation could go on for hours and hours, but maybe one day in the future we'll have you back on SMWX. I know that people will demand it on social media for the rest of my life. So, but I wanted to also pick your brain as a historian, because I wonder, part of my own writing at the moment is thinking about South Africa away from the end of history narrative that was constructed in 1994, and seeing this period as potentially a period of transition itself, where there may be a totally different future. And I'm just encouraging myself and asking of others, how do you think that future historians will see this period? In, say, I don't know when, but how do you think people will look back at this society as historians?
In 2050 or something?
Yeah.
Gosh, it's a really interesting question, and I pondered on it even when I saw you invite, and I don't have an answer per se. And I think let's wing it, because I think it invites us to sort of like be forward looking whilst looking backwards. And I think history often happens in the rear view mirror, and the future often happens as we are, the future happens in the rear view mirror, I should say, and the history often happens as we're moving forward and we're making it and creating it in different ways. And I as an amateur historian, which is what I consider myself to be, I think this moment represents so many possibilities. So, I mean, I think in this country specifically, I mean, other than what we've mentioned, this is the one country I think that many people have had great expectations of, because we've been given such a massive endowment. So an endowment of talent, an endowment of natural resources, and I think an endowment of international goodwill, I think in 1994, which was probably, people use the word unprecedented quite loosely, but I think it was, because South Africa was a special case. It was a special child, the child of everybody's aspirations, the child that everybody hoped for, the child of long struggle. I think it was like this, like hard labor, right? It's like this child who finally comes out after like a 2-year labor. You push, and finally they're there. And of course, there were reasons that this child took longer to arrive, and that those are economic reasons. Those are to do with the propping up, of course, of people like Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan. May their rotten souls rest somewhere happy. But I do think that certainly, it's to do with the way that apartheid and settler colonialism were propped up for so long. So we were born into this wonderful waters of exceptional goodwill, and what we could have done was to leverage the social contract in a different way, right? Leverage it in a way that was possibly going to be more redistributive and more boldly so. So rather than talking left and going right, we should have talked left and gone left, and been more unequivocal about it. And I think that is linked to the sort of this disdainful top-down, elitist kind of leadership, unfortunately, that we've had going, across many liberation struggles across the continent, and South Africa being no exception, right? So that's the one thing, but also, unnecessary compromises. And I think my political position is well understood and well known in this regard. The Codesa moment, unnecessary. And I think that the many unnecessary concessions, people are like, well, maybe there would have been blood, there would have been a civil war. We were already at war. More people died between 1985 and 1994 than the previous 150 or 200 years of armed combat in this country, including the battles with kings and so forth. So I think people will look back and think, well, what did you do with that? What did you do with all of that opportunity to reframe a different kind of imagination? If somebody like Castro in 1960 or 61, was it? He and Raoul and Che, if they could frame something that was so bold, right on the shoulders, in the backyard of Babylon, the belly of the beast, why couldn't South Africa think through that? And I think it's really a question of ideological and political choices, respectability politics, this kind of overarching need to become part of the international polity, the community of nations. And I think almost at the expense of thinking through what sovereignty means as an African state today, and also appreciating that the state of the state, right? The state of post-independent states, in 1964, a Zambia, a Kenya, a Ghana, of course, the great beacon at the time, was not the state of the state in 1994. I think there was space to be a lot more savvy, to rethink some of those sorts of, the internationalization of states, the financialization of economies, the overwhelming integration, and to rethink that quite carefully. I also think that it will be seen as a moment where Black lives should have mattered more, but really didn't, where I think our social contract was so diminished, where actually even our social cultural imaginations could have been differently framed. And I look at Nollywood, and people can say what they want about Nollywood. Sizwe, the thing produces, people you go around the world, you're on a plane, and this thing is in your face, right? It gives you a sense of, it gives any Nigerian, in fact, any African, because when I'm out there, I'm an African, right? It's like, my people, I see myself, right? I identify and I relate. And I think that we really haven't understood the role of socio-cultural reconstruction as an important inherent part of the nation building. So the cultural economy, not artifacts and beads. I mean, those are fine. I mean, I love my beads, but not just artifacts and beads and dashikis, but also like in a deep way that actually frames an African identity. I think we'll be seen perhaps as the people who didn't imagine themselves when we could have, and we'll ask ourselves why. We'll ask ourselves, I think, well, in 2050, they're looking back at us and they're thinking, but why isn't every African child, and why isn't everybody who calls themselves a South African obliged to learn an African language in school? They probably will ask themselves, why? But like, why? If you're an African, if you say you're an African and you owe your allegiances to this country, why were you not obliged to learn an African country? Why were our children sent to so-called good schools? Guilty as charged. My children went to the same so-called good schools. Fortunately, I speak Sesotho to them.
I had to learn Xhosa later in my life, and absolutely.
Yeah. But why were our children, even the children of the middle class, farmed out to so-called good schools in order to become whitewashed? Why was that seen, and why was our grasp of the English language seen as the measure of our success, of our brilliance? I mean, I don't know how many people walk into share platforms with, walk into meetings, and all a person has is the hua hua. There's no substance. It's like, without the hua hua, what is there? Without the accent and without the affectation, what is there? All due respect. I mean, I know I have a bit of hua myself, but hopefully with a lot of substance as well. And that's from my parents, right? And I think that what is really important as well, what they'll probably ask is, why did we not do something about land? What were we thinking? What were we thinking, allowing this to become a keg bomb? And I wonder what 2015 will look like. I don't know, I'll be quite an elderly lady by then, but I hope I live to see it. I wonder what they will say. I wonder whether the land question in this country will also have filtered across I wonder whether by then we'll be talking about a federal republic of Southern Africa, or a reintegrated Southern Africa, a Lesotho, Swaziland, Namibia, Botswana state. I wonder if they'll look back and think, why didn't we think of trying that? Because this is actually what we live in is a series of compromises of apartheid imperialism. I mean, the Basotho, we had to go and guard our little 40 acres and a mule. The Swatis also had to go and guard their 40 acres and a mule. Botswana guarded, well, theirs is a huge territory. But I mean, I wonder if they'll ask what about the era of missed opportunities and why it is that the state took their eye off the ball and was so dismissive and disdainful of Black people, African people, that they chose corporate interests over our own.
Well, Mayor Lebohang Pheko, thanks so much for joining us on SMWX, and we really appreciate you taking the time to be with our audience and share your considerable insights.
Thank you, Dr. Mpofu-Walsh. Really enjoyed myself.